My sources, the vast majority of which are drawn from the ancient Hebrew Bible, also known as the Tanakh, are listed in this video's description. Alright, listen closely and try to guess what I'm describing. It has a long snout and smoke pours from its nostrils. It breathes fire. It has wings and can fly. It dwells inside of a mountain, hoarding its golden treasure. Lastly, it eats livestock, and yes, you heard this right, female virgins too. Well, did you guess Yahweh? If you guessed the God of the Israelites, known by the sacred name Yahweh as described in the Hebrew Bible, you'd be absolutely correct. Of course, these two are the stereotypical and practically universal descriptors of the mythical creature known as a dragon. But perhaps this connection between the two should not be so surprising. In the various English versions of the Bible, the Hebrew word apayim is typically translated as a fanciful synonym of face or anger. Modern scholars, however, deem this translation as inaccurate. Why? Because out of the 9 verses that describe Yahweh with this word, all of them specifically reference its elongation and length, which makes absolutely no sense when describing Yahweh's face or anger. These length references are completely omitted in most translations, likely because the translators found the descriptor to be nonsensical. But in the original Hebrew, they indeed remain. Moreover, there are other forms of this word with the same meaning identified throughout the Bible, many of which are used to further describe this feature of Yahweh. So, what does apayim actually mean? With overwhelming agreement from biblical scholars, the word literally translates to nostrils. This leaves us with the perplexing mystery as to why Yahweh's apparently long nostrils were so important that they were mentioned so many times throughout multiple generations of Scripture. To explain, scholars assume that in ancient Israel, Yahweh may have been seen as a beast with lengthy, protruding nostrils. For example, an alligator, a bull, or, of course, a dragon. This list of potential candidates can quickly be narrowed down, though, by looking at a few key verses. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 22 states the following: "For a fire is kindled in my nostrils, and shall burn to the lowest hell, and it shall consume the earth with her increase, and set ablaze the foundations of the mountains." And then we have the description of Yahweh in Psalms. "Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from out of his mouth. Coals flamed forth from him." Very interestingly, this description of the God of the Israelites is exactly paralleled by the Book of Job's depiction of the monstrous creature Leviathan, which is generally accepted to be an actual biblical dragon. "Out of his mouth go burning torches, and sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils go smoke, as out of a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth." Moving along, but still relevant to our discussion of Yahweh's nostrils, there is evidence of ancient discourse on whether Yahweh could actually intervene in the world unless his long nostrils, as a metaphor for his physical presence, could reach the site of intervention. This directly challenges the idea of the omnipresence and omnipotence of the Israelite God, and implies that Yahweh may actually be a physical being with limitations. This is found in Psalms chapter 10. "The wicked says, from the height of his nostrils, he, Yahweh, will not seek us." What the wicked is implying is that when Yahweh is not physically near their location, mankind can get away with sinful acts without punishment. Of course, the wicked's assumption is immediately rejected by the writer in Psalms, but this contrarian opinion must have been prominent enough for the writer to mention it. Before we proceed to the next argument, on the possibility of Yahweh's physical nature, Might this be why he required a massive portable tent known as a tabernacle, as recorded in Exodus? For 440 years, this building-sized tent was the supposed earthly dwelling place of Yahweh, where offerings of prepared meals as well as sacrificed livestock were given on a daily basis, and a thick smoke was known to appear at the door when it was opened. Of course, the true purpose of the tabernacle continues to be hotly debated and is beyond the scope of this video. In Psalm 91 verse 4, we see a mention of Yahweh's feathers. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. Pinions are the flight feathers of a wing. We may not immediately connotate feathers with the image of a dragon, but the fact is that many ancient depictions of winged dragons included feathered wings, up until the medieval era. It is here where this rabbit hole really takes a questionable turn. In our investigation of the nostrils, I briefly mentioned Yahweh's massive tent, the tabernacle, where he received prepared food and sacrificed livestock on a daily basis. Of course, this is far from the only instance Yahweh accepted edible offerings. In chapter 31 of the book of Numbers, Yahweh commands the prophet Moses and his army of 12,000 men to take revenge against the Midianites and wage bloody war on their people. For readability's sake, we'll use the New Living Translation, but you'll find that, regardless of your version of the Bible, the explicit details of this passage are exactly the same. After murdering every Midianite man and their leaders, pillaging their city, and capturing all the women and children, Moses commands his troops to kill all the boys and all the women who have had intercourse with a man. It's passages like these that remind you how brutal the older scriptures really were. Moving on though, Moses and his men divide their plunder and give a portion of it to Yahweh, which includes 32 Midianite virgins who were never heard from again. I'm not kidding, you can read the verse yourself. It says, quote, "Half of the plunder was given to the fighting men. It totaled 337,500 sheep and goats, of which 675 were the Lord's share, 36,000 cattle, of which 72 were the Lord's share, 30,500 donkeys, of which 61 were the Lord's share, and 16,000 virgin girls, of whom 32 were the Lord's share." It goes on though. Moses and Eleazar the priest received the gold from all the military commanders, all kinds of jewelry and crafted objects. In all, the gold that the generals and captains presented as a gift to the Lord weighed about 420 pounds. Okay, there's a lot of details here, so let's talk about the livestock first. The majority of dragons in folklore are carnivores, meaning they eat meat. That one's obvious. But realistically, what could Yahweh possibly want with 32 virgins and 420 pounds of gold? Well, it is an interesting revelation that for many of the cultures that worshipped dragons in the past, the preferred sacrificial offerings were indeed virgin girls. The Aztecs sacrificed a virgin girl to the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl twice a year in their 18-month calendar. In Japanese Shinto tradition, the 8-headed dragon Orochi demanded the sacrifice of the virgin daughters of 2 minor deities every 7 years. And perhaps you've heard of George and the Dragon. This classical folktale, which is confirmed to predate Christianity, tells of a dragon that demanded a sheep and a maiden, aka a female virgin, sacrifice every day. Why this idea is so prevalent and consistent across cultures and time remains unknown. However, in European folklore, the pure, untainted blood of virgins is sometimes implied to be equal in value to gold, and is often used in a manner of currency, for example, as a means of exchange with the dragon, or appeasement. Collecting and hoarding gold is, of course, a stereotype of dragons that remains portrayed in popular media to this day, though it is indeed ancient, as well as a consistent trait found across the world. For instance, the typical dragon in medieval Christian folklore guarded a mountainous cavern or castle filled to the brim with treasure. This same trope is also found thousands of years prior across the globe in the classical Chinese mythology of the Fucang, which translates to Hidden Treasure Dragon, a guardian of precious metals and jewels who dwells in volcanic mountains. If you're not familiar with the Ten Commandments, the second and relevant commandment to our next argument is, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," which prohibits the creation and worship of idols. In some interpretations, the chief concern is not necessarily the worship of just any image, but rather whether one is pursuing a false god as opposed to the true God. This little tidbit may explain why Yahweh actually does permit one idol. This lone idol, known as Nehushtan, depicts none other than a so-called fiery serpent. And more than just permitting the idol, he essentially forces the Israelites to make and worship it by threatening their lives. This odd event occurs in the book of Numbers, chapter 21. During their long journey to the land of Edom, the Israelites struggle with hunger and dehydration in the wilderness and complain to Yahweh. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" Annoyed by their grumbling, Yahweh sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much of the people of Israel died. In the throes of desperation, the survivors begged the prophet Moses to pray to Yahweh and end their torment. Moses obliged. And Yahweh said unto Moses, "Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten shall live when he sees it." And Moses made a serpent of copper, and set it upon the pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he looked unto the serpent of copper, he lived. Later on, in the second book of Kings, this idol is given a name, Nehushtan, which translates to the Great Serpent. The king Hezekiah, before ordering Nehushtan to be destroyed, states that, "For unto those days the children of Israel did offer to it," which, in no uncertain terms, means that the idol was worshipped. Why would Yahweh order the creation of a copper idol of a fiery serpent that would certainly be worshipped, especially as it prevented death? As it was the only idol he ever permitted, might we assume that this fiery serpent was a likeness of his own? Another question remains. Why copper? Well, in several verses throughout the Old Scripture, it's actually implied that Yahweh dwells in mountains of copper. This is explicitly stated in the book of Zechariah, as well as implied by mentioning his origins in the mountainous Arabah and Sinai regions, which were well known for copper mining in ancient times. Though it may seem like a tangent, I bring this up because I'm sure you know which mythical creature makes its home in the mountains and has a love for valuable metals. Coincidentally, multiple studies suggest that long before being worshipped by the Israelites, Yahweh was actually the Canaanite god of metallurgy. And what might be the ancient symbol of Canaanite smelters? A copper serpent mounted on a staff. But returning to that awful punishment in the wilderness, why did Yahweh specifically send fiery serpents? And just what made them so fiery? Note that the term used by Yahweh was actually the Hebrew word seraph, which means to burn. Yet in 5 of the 7 instances where it is used in the Hebrew Bible, it is a noun that inarguably refers to a serpent or snake. This is an example of ancient wordplay, and thus seraph is generally accepted to mean fiery serpent. But what about the two exceptions? We'll dive into this mystery next. In English versions of the Bible, 5 of the 7 instances of the word seraph are translated to fiery serpent or something very similar. The 2 exceptions are in Isaiah chapter 6. Both use the plural form seraphim and leave it untranslated. This passage is actually somewhat well known, and perhaps some of you may already be familiar with the image of this angelic creature. Above him stood the seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he did fly. Because we can reliably substitute seraphim with fiery serpents, we can go on to make another connection. The verse specifies that they have wings and feet. A fiery flying serpent with wings and feet sounds a lot less like a snake and more like, a dragon. This isn't the only time seraphim are stated to have the ability to fly. 2 distinct times within the book of Isaiah, there is mention of a seraph paired with the Hebrew adjective for flying, typically translating to flying serpent in most English versions of the Bible. Written in the 8th century BC, the book of Isaiah may have been one of the earliest written records of these small draconic creatures in the Sinai and Arabian deserts, but it actually wasn't the only record of their existence. There are several non-biblical references to flying serpents made around the same time and location as the book of Isaiah. In the 7th century BC, the king of Assyria documented yellow flying serpents that threatened his troops in the desert during a war campaign against Egypt. And in the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote about winged serpents that could fly and would frequently attack Egypt. Herodotus also noted that these winged serpents are nowhere to be seen except in Arabia. Both of these accounts are considered reliable and remain debated in the scholarly community as to what creatures these texts are actually describing, as, of course, it seems a bit fantastical. Egypt is actually an incredibly important connection, because it is believed that reference to seraphim might extend as far back as the 3rd millennium BC, in the form of the Egyptian pharaoh's uraeus, a symbol which conveyed the ruler's divine authority. Egyptian iconography has depicted 2- and 4-winged versions of the uraeus, and ancient amulets of multiple winged uraeus have been found as far away as Palestine. Yet another connection exists. The ancient Egyptian noun seraph describes a type of snake, often depicted with wings and connotated with warmth and heat. Indeed, this Egyptian term, seraph, is theorized to be the predecessor of the Hebrew word seraph, as they sound remarkably similar, and both describe the same fiery flying serpentine creature, one which seemed to exist in the Sinai and Arabian deserts up until 2,000 years ago. Biblical scholars note that there is an essential relationship between Yahweh and the seraphim. The seraphim are considered by all Abrahamic religions to be high-ranking angels, or even the highest of all, as in Christian tradition. Moreover, seraphim are said to fly around the throne of Yahweh in intense worship, and act immediately and aggressively on his command. Flying seraphim, in particular, are involved in prophecies of his vengeance. And not long after commanding the Israelites never to worship false idols, Yahweh orders his followers to build and worship a likeness of a seraph, which is essentially a holy flying fiery reptile, made of the very copper that Yahweh himself is closely associated with. All this does paint an unexpected picture of Yahweh, the God of Israel, who may or may not be in command of an army of small dragons. Make of that what you will. If we were to go ahead and assume that the god Yahweh was indeed a dragon, we'd have some difficult philosophical questions to answer. does this invalidate the Abrahamic religions which evolved from the Hebrew Scriptures? Have Jews, Christians, and Muslims been worshipping a false god for thousands of years? In my humble opinion, the answer to both is not necessarily. It would just require a significant amount of reinterpretation of the Hebrew Scripture. Something not many people know unless they study the history of Abrahamic religions is that there is actually implication of at least two distinct gods in the Hebrew Bible, one being Yahweh and the other being El. It's true that in many cases the names seem to be used interchangeably, but scholars have noted that there may actually be evidence that separates them as deities, specifically in the older scriptures. In all instances, El is the most supreme. He is the God of gods. For sure, the two names become completely interchangeable around the era of Moses, where Yahweh introduces himself. I am Yahweh. I revealed myself to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, but was not known to them by my name, Yahweh. But before this era, during the time of the prophet Abraham and Proto-Israelite religion, El and Yahweh were almost definitely worshipped as separate deities, with Yahweh being merely one of the gods of El's council. In Deuteronomy, we can actually find a rare example of this, a glimpse into that long-forgotten ancient belief. When the Most High, El, gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated humanity, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of divine beings. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob and his allotted heritage. Note that this verse can widely vary in its many translations, especially due to its polytheistic implications. For example, the phrase, "the number of divine beings," has been alternatively translated to "the angels of God," "the number in his heavenly court," as well as "the number of El's children." We can put this debate to rest though, because the Hebrew word in question is Elohim, which is a plural noun signifying multiple gods. In this context, scholars see them as a council of gods, with El being the Most High. At the end of the verse, El divides the world and gives Yahweh the nation of Israel. This little detail changes everything. The God of the Israelites was never the God of all of existence. Yahweh was a lesser deity who served under El. There are other subtle references to this so-called Council of El. Psalm 82 speaks of an assembly of El. Psalm 29 encourages the sons of El to worship Yahweh, which implies that Yahweh's ranking in the council was high. Finally, in Psalm 89, we once again have scriptural evidence and explicit mention that Yahweh is a high ranker of the many sons of El. For who in the heavens can be compared to Yahweh? Who can be likened to Yahweh among the sons of El? Again, this is the closest translation to the original Hebrew. El is, in fact, much older than the biblical Yahweh. El was the supreme god of the ancient and polytheistic Canaanite religion, with El's first mention dating as far back as 2000 BC. In all likelihood, El was the god worshipped by the original prophet Abraham, not Yahweh.
In the world's dawn, God created the heavens and the earth on the second day. And on the very same day, God created the angels, archangels, and cherubim. And these heavenly creatures would inhabit the heavens. The renowned Gabriel and Michael were among these magnificent beings. But there was yet another entity who stood out due to his beauty and splendor, known as Lucifer. He was the most important creature God had ever created. But although he had so many qualities, or perhaps due to that, Lucifer was taken by pride. This is the vice that leads to arrogance, vanity, and endless haughtiness. Pride was one of the 7 deadly sins. The proud Lucifer considered himself to be so perfect that he decided to create his own throne, placed even above God, since he wished to be like God. To accomplish his plan, the evil angel deceived the other angels around him. Therefore, the father of falsehood had by his side a third of the angelic beings who inhabited the heavens. Together, they would unleash a battle for heaven. But Lucifer encountered an outstanding opponent, Archangel Michael, who commanded the heavenly militia of God-loving angels. To defeat the Lord's angels, Lucifer turned himself into a mighty dragon and dueled against Michael, who wielded a flaming sword. Notwithstanding all his might, the dragon did not defeat Michael, since the latter had God by his side. Lucifer and his evil angels were banished from heaven. These angels fell on the earth and were trapped in hell. But Lucifer endured even greater punishment. He, once the most beautiful angel, was transformed into the heinous Satan. Lucifer and his fallen angels started to live in hell. But although defeated, Satan still wanted to avenge himself against his creator and decided to attack his greatest creation, humanity itself, which had been created in the image and likeness of God. A serpent-shaped Satan entered the Garden of Eden and convinced the innocent Eve to taste the forbidden fruit. And using his deceitful tongue, Lucifer concatenated the original sin, which caused Adam and Eve to be driven out of paradise. After that, Satan would devote all his efforts to alienate man from God, turning them into sinners so that they failed to reach paradise. Lucifer, the fallen angel, rejected God's grace, and therefore will spend eternity trying to destroy his work.